We went from just say no as a narrative, across the board to just say nothing. And at the same time, we've had the growth of festivals, we've had the growth of media, obviously. And more than anything, perhaps, we've had the growth of the anonymity of an individual. What Telegram is doing is mirroring like an Amazon or an eBay model of next day or almost immediate delivery, and earning people lots of money, often outside of organised. I think our audience would be very empathetic towards the idea of someone being excluded from school and losing that structure and losing that protective factor and saying, well, what on earth am I going to do? Well, do you know what? I'm already stigmatised. There's already judgment there. So let's double down. And here I go. I can get absolutely any drug that I can pretty much think of on the internet sent to me at cut price, and I can flip that on the street, either to mates or to a wider group, which is extremely worrying times.
All these online spaces that young people occupy, drugs are there, and they're also incredibly prevalent in our popular culture, aren't they? There's an infiltration of drug use across all of our popular culture, and I'm not putting judgment over this. I'm just highlighting the fact that shift and change, I think, has evolved how young people procure drugs and use drugs, think about drugs and talk about drugs.
We need young people to have this education around this because the choice is there, and Telegram menus have, you've seen them, Paul, they have every drug pretty much that we know of that is in any way considered mainstream at all, available at a very affordable price.
In this episode, I speak to Nick Hickmott, who is the Early Intervention Lead at With You in Kent. I love talking to Nick. I always find him such a nuanced, sensible, kind, positive, knowledgeable person when it comes to drug use in the UK, particularly amongst young people. And he's always been my go-to contact for any time a journalist gets in touch with me and wants to better understand what's happening for young people in the UK. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Nick. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and also check out the Drug Education Forum, the details of which you can find in the description.
Nick, so you and I have spent a lot of time working in the drug treatment sector, and I thought a good place to start this conversation is to think about how the selling of drugs to young people has evolved in that time. So how would you best describe that evolution and shift in the way in which young people procure and buy drugs? And we'll move that conversation on to what's the impact of that change.
Well, I think, obviously, as you know, Paul, well, we've both been around a long time now, kind of knocking on 15 years, and I think things have changed exponentially, really. I mean, when I started working in drug treatment, we were kind of coming in with a bit of a hangover from The Wire, really. That was the model, right? There was this
What a series.
Yeah, like there was I mean, like the best. That's what TV was invented for, right? If you haven't seen The Wire, go watch The Wire.
Go watch The Wire.
But that there were local dealers working in local areas, that drugs were very much localized, and that we were using methods that were shared amongst the general population. So, in the case of The Wire, it's payphones, and maybe we're moving a bit on from that. We're not that old, but like that you had a local dealer and that they had generally a legacy or a reputation in that area for doing what they did. And the options around that were limited, right? So there was probably one or two. It's not the same kind of postcode lottery or violence that we see now, but you knew who that person was. And generally they were considered to be someone who could handle himself or have a bit of a nefarious kind of reputation, should we say. And that's why they'd ended up to use kind of a drug war narrative, hitting rock bottom and ended up selling drugs to kids or young people. And I think that's where it started. And with that was very manageable because it did fit the narrative and it did fit what went alongside the tabloids. And I think it kept, much like a lot of the old scaremongering and scare stories of drug taking did, I think that kept a lot of people safe and away from illicit substances. I don't know if you'd agree.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I 100% agree. And I think back to when I was at school and I was younger, multiple people who tried to get drugs would get beaten up and just get nicked. They just kind of get scammed and they get nicked. And it was this kind of like acceptance that, well, yeah, I mean, you're buying an illicit drug. It's going to be a bit sketchy. It's going to be a bit dodgy. And it's not that easy. You kind of got to know the right person and you've got to have someone who's like, fine, I'll go for it. I'll go speak to them, particularly when you're younger. Obviously things change as you approach adulthood, different dynamics, but yeah, it was definitely a very, very different relationship to what it is now. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to think and talk about the impact that at the time versus now has on the market and the accessibility point. Because again, that's it's a very different picture and world now, isn't it? The digitalization of the world that we live in has meant that, you know, that sort of like wire image of like things being, you know, meeting people on street corners and it all like being a little bit face to face, a little bit sketchy, as we know, you know, and as we both know from the work that we've done over the past like 5, 6, 7 years thinking about this. It's a completely different landscape. And I think that a lot of professionals still think about drug dealing in that kind of old school wire way. There's still a lot of social perceptions amongst professionals and just the broader public around it still being this sort of like old school way in which people buy drugs. But it's not all.
Well, I completely agree with that point, and I think that, you know, whilst everyone who was alive in the time when we were at school, you know, whilst we've all gone on and studied different things and become teachers or doctors or drug workers or whatever we've been doing, the drug market didn't stand still in the same way that society didn't, right? You know, the fact that we're able to do this now online with multiple devices around us doing different things, you know, says it all really. And I think, unfortunately, what didn't go hand in hand with the development of other industries was drug education for professionals and for young people. And it just felt like we slept on it really a little bit. You know, we went from just say no as a narrative, you know, across the board to just say nothing. And at the same time, we've had the growth of festivals, you know, we've had the growth of media, obviously. And more than anything, perhaps, we've had the growth of the anonymity of an individual. So you can do things and not be necessarily called out for it. And I think that's the difference between being the kid seen in the wrong street or with the wrong person, that would follow you around, get reported back from school. You know, it just felt like that was more joined up. And maybe that's a bit of a romantic notion, but like the digital side of it is absolutely kind of, in the same way we buy things from Amazon today to have them delivered tomorrow, and the same way we're recording this podcast now, drugs was never going to sleep because supply and demand, you know, and what it offered was an opportunity to buy drugs with, you know, less risk, I guess, is the answer there. And that's changed everything for young people.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. You touch on an interesting point there as well, I think, around the internet and the birth of the internet. And I think drug use, drug procurement of old was scary because you didn't know loads about who you were getting it from and what you were getting and what could go wrong, what could go right. It was kind of like it was very much an unknown, and it took a certain kind of character to embark upon that journey. And don't get me wrong, there were lots of people that did. I'm not saying that, you know, young people didn't use drugs. Yeah, of course they did. Of course there's always been young people that have used substances. But now in a modern digital age and the birth of the internet, I think it created a situation where in education systems, drugs education dropped a little bit off a cliff, and the just say no message kind of just perpetuated and wasn't very effective. But then at the same time, young people who were better at navigating the internet than anybody else and more averse with the internet than anybody else used that to learn about drugs and realize that, like, well, hang on, maybe this just say no thing and this, like, if you do this, you're just going to get addicted or you're just going to die is actually not true, because I can go on this forum and read this. I can see this person who's done that. I can see that piece of digital culture, that like piece of popular culture that's showing me this. And I think while in the past, young people were somewhat protected by what was on TV, you know, if there wasn't like loads of chat about drugs on TV, you might not be subjected to a great deal of drug-based information. Whereas now, young people could Google MDMA and quickly find out loads of information about that substance, about that drug, good and bad, useful and not useful. So I think this kind of like veil dropped a little bit with the birth of the internet around drugs. And at the same time, the methods by which young people could procure drugs just rapidly changed. It just went from that kind of scarier, it's a little bit sketch, this could all go completely wrong, to, oh, I just text someone. Like,
yeah.
I just communicate with this person in the same way that I do everybody else in my entire life. And they seem quite friendly. It's not like it's not this kind of like, oh God, it's just a random number I've been given. I've got to go meet them. I've got to go around to the house. Completely different. Maybe we should open that up a little bit and kind of describe or outline the main way in which young people are sold drugs. So, you know, you're the best person to answer this question, I think, in the country, the work that you do. So how would you best describe the ways in which young people currently procure drugs?
Well, I think they fall into two categories, really, Paul. I think it's still definitely have what we describe as legacy dealing. You know, that there's someone who's been in a community, and for whatever reason, you know, whether that's generational drug use, i.e., their children have started to kind of follow the career of their father or mother in no uncertain terms and started to deal drugs to a new generation, and that it's never gone wrong. So it's never been potentially associated with a drug related death, or there's certainly not been exponential harm which would see them ousted from that community in that role. You know, like things have gone okay. So they've been a cannabis dealer on this estate or down this road for 25 years and nothing's ever happened. And where that's the model, you know, you get like this safety profile with it by this idea of them being a community figure, right? That if we've got Kev down the road, sorry Kev, but if we've got Kev
Soz
down
Kev.
the road, soz mate. So if we've got him and he's selling good weed, and he's always sold good weed, and maybe he sells a couple of other drugs as well, like mainstay drugs that are in our society, like cocaine or potentially MDMA or pills, that if that's never gone wrong, then there's an element of trust there in his supply. But also we start to see this model, if we zoom out, we can start to see this model of why on earth would Kev want to hurt people when this is his livelihood, right? So we often have this from your school recollections, you know, what you can remember is scaremongering around drugs, just say no narrative that you're a bit young for Zamo, but you know, that actually people were seeing public service announcements. And when there's 4 channels, everyone's watching the same thing. So when you go to school, you have this idea that's kind of plumbed into you. But then there's Kev. And people are going to Kev, and every Friday and Saturday night from kind of year 9 or year 10 upwards, when you're going out, you'll see people using Kev's product, and just having a great time, right? And so it goes against kind of your education, and I use that word loosely because it wasn't an education, it was scaremongering tactics. So if we've got Kev and he's kind of doing what he's doing, then you know there's often no need to be going into a digital market and risking, or have the perceived risk of postage or interception or being scammed or bots and all that kind of stuff. And I think where we still see that legacy model is often in villages, smaller towns, kind of coastal towns, where this has always been the way. And maybe there's a captive audience that can't be, you know, it's as big as it's going to get. Maybe the population is what the population is, and there's 1 or 2 kind of groups of people within that who use drugs. And in that case, this legacy dealing route would work absolutely. But I guess what we've seen during the development of, first of all, social media, so you know you were actively involved with VoltFast and DM for Details, was that we started seeing the selling of drugs on social media, particularly to young people, and since then, you know, that being used really as a platform to advertise things like encrypted messaging services such as Telegram, which is probably the other mainstay, particularly for young people, for accessing drugs. And whilst it's, you know, I don't want to pigeonhole groups of people who are accessing it, but it could be the same people. It could still be the same people who are isolated in a village that doesn't have a local drug dealer. But also in a city, what Telegram is doing is mirroring like an Amazon or an eBay model of next day or almost immediate delivery, and earning people lots of money, often outside of organised. What Telegram is doing is mirroring like an Amazon or an eBay model of next day or almost immediate delivery, and earning people lots of money, often outside of organised. It's like the market square of the internet, you know. So again, back to our wire analogy, that you knew where to go and get drugs in Baltimore or wherever you were, but actually that anyone can kind of walk into Telegram with a few £100 and flip that £100 really quickly. So there's an opportunity for people not only to be entrepreneurial and make a bit of money, but also to put food on the table in times of austerity, to create identity, particularly when there's other protective factors that have been removed. And, you know, I think our audience would be very empathetic towards the idea of someone being excluded from school and losing that structure and losing that protective factor and saying, well, what on earth am I going to do? Well, do you know what? I'm already stigmatized. There's already judgment there. So let's double down. And here I go. I can get absolutely any drug that I can pretty much think of on the internet sent to me at a cut price, and I can flip that on the street, either to mates or to a wider group, which is extremely worrying times.
Yeah, I agree, and saw that myself when I worked in drug treatment services en masse. Like, yeah, I agree 100%. There's definitely been that shift. There's definitely been that change, and it has allowed people to be quite entrepreneurial around the procurement and the sale of drugs. And you can make, this again, not that we would. It's an awful idea. It's an absolutely terrible idea, fueled with exceptionally high risk, which is why a lot of vulnerable people make the decision to do it, because they are caring less about the risk and more about the reward. But there's a lot of money to be made doing it. If you look at, nearly every other product that we buy has been subject to inflation. Everything is more expensive. I'm constantly telling people how expensive chickens are. Chickens are now 20 quid, Nick. I don't know if you've seen this, but a chicken is about £20 in Waitrose. Not that I think anyone should shop in Waitrose, because it's completely overinflated and absolutely ridiculous. But chickens are £20. When we, if we were to be like, right, a free range chicken is 20 quid now. A gram of cocaine is 80 ish pounds now. Let's go back and go back to the sort of time we were talking about, this pre-digital era, and compare the price of a chicken to what it is now. It'd be £5. It'd be so much lower. But if we were to look at the price of drugs, they stay pretty consistent. So we've got a market that is not really affected by inflation, and we've got a market that is just completely unregulated in every sense. I mean, it's sort of a libertarian's dream in a way, the illegal drug market, because there's just no regulation. I mean, other than the fact that it's illegal, obviously, but, you shouldn't do it. But there's no market restrictions. You choose to sell it for whatever you want to sell it, and I think that allows people to make a lot of money, allows people to become quite entrepreneurial. And I think it's definitely diversified the cohort of people that sell drugs, but also significantly diversified the cohort of people who procure and use drugs. And I think there's this other kind of like social shift that I can kind of sense, and I certainly sense this through a lot of the harm reduction work that I've done over the years. We could go deep with this as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think the procurement of drugs is not an abnormal conversation amongst young people. It's not this kind of like sketchy, scary thing. I just think because of the digitalization of it, and because of the I'm not saying it's socially normal to procure drugs, but I don't think it's socially alarming for a lot of people to talk about the procurement of drugs. Whereas previously, I think there was a little bit more of it was a bit more judgment, a bit of a scary thing. And again, I would put that down to the evolution of the market. The fact that the market now exists in an online space. It exists on Telegram, it exists on WhatsApp, it exists on Snapchat, it exists on Facebook. All these online spaces that young people occupy, drugs are there, and they're also incredibly prevalent in our popular culture, aren't they? There's an infiltration of drug use across all of our popular culture, and I'm not putting judgment over this. I'm just highlighting the fact that shift and change, I think, has evolved how young people procure drugs and use drugs, think about drugs, and talk about drugs.
Well, certainly think about drugs, Paul. And I do completely agree with your points there. And if we think about, if I said, if I was mentioning that you go back to Zammo, and if you were watching Grange Hill, then everyone in your class.
Who's this Zammo you keep mentioning? Because I think I am too old for Zammo. I used to watch Grange Hill, but who's Zammo? Is he a character on Grange Hill?
Zammo was a great. So he's the Just Say No poster boy, right? And I know you know.
Okay.
But he was the one who.
No.
Really?
I honestly don't.
Okay, so at the end of the pod, maybe you can link in the Just Say No theme tune, which is Zammo and friends singing Just Say No.
Oh, right. No, I have seen. Okay, yeah, I've seen.
So my point is that everyone was seeing the same things, right? So everyone was. If there's a limited amount of media in your house, in your world, which was 4 channels, when I was certainly, up till I was about 15, there was only 4 things, and everyone was receiving the same messages. So you didn't have this infiltration of all of these different media types, which is kind of, to your point, Paul, was normalized drug culture. So if we think about that being a really strong narrative, that actually schools were saying don't do drugs, the government was saying don't do drugs. We had things like DARE being rolled out in America, but this kind of stuff was coming out of the UK as well. And there was a very overwhelming message of this is bad. Now, in this period of what I kind of call like moving from just say no to just say nothing, look at where we are now. Look at long form podcasts with like Joe Rogan, right, where you can listen to 4 hours worth of DMT. Look at front pages of the newspapers. Mum's microdosing with psychedelics. Ketamine makes users feel less depressed according to science. Shows like Euphoria, shows like Skins, right? Like these like really, really popular culture that was streamed into our living rooms when we were young, but is continuing today. Where's the PSA which says drugs are dangerous now and drugs are harmful, which is why we need to talk about them? Where's that message now? Well, it doesn't exist. In fact, what exists is that drugs are normal, that more people are using drugs than ever before, that half the states in America have a regulated cannabis model, that you've been able to get a script of weed for the last 8 years in the UK. And actually, if you take your kids on London Underground, they're going, what is Relief? What are these companies? Because it is absolutely everywhere. So there is now no narrative around staying safe around drugs or drug education or, thinking about your choices around drugs other than in institutions. So the workplace, or for young people, education. Like in schools, they have clear policies around drugs, which could be clearer. It's often a token that you don't take drugs to school. But I maintain that unless you're reinforcing this all the time with your students and talking about why, then young people will make mistakes. But I think culture has shifted exponentially from a very hard line of drugs are bad to now drugs are part of our society and they are normal, and they have associations such as MDMA and festivals, cannabis, and rather than a glass of wine after work or alcohol, cannabis is absolutely acceptable for a massive proportion of the population. And generationally, this has happened. So, we have people our age, people older than us who've adopted drug taking behaviours, and their children have seen this, and there's been no kind of counter to that. And not for a minute am I saying we bring back just say no, but at the same time, to your point, education dropped off a cliff. So our young people are confused, concerned, but also living in a reality where scaremongering doesn't work, and we've got the evidence to back this. We can't scare people out of taking drugs. Just say no doesn't work, because drugs are about supply and demand, and people are using them, and young people are observing people using them and using them for fun, using them for pleasure, or using them as a tool. And somehow our job is to bridge this gap between, we need to talk about drugs because they are dangerous, not talk about them because they are perceived as bad or wrong, or not punching down, but also not just saying actually this is a free for all, it's all fine.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I've always felt you touched on a few things there, but I think the morality of the subject makes it a difficult conversation, a bit like sex education. And I think you've heard me mention a few times on different things that we've done together. I kind of compare drugs education a little bit to sex education, that there has been an evolution of the discussion, and now it's very normal. You do have sex, although drugs education does sit to some extent within a curriculum lightly in schools. Like sex education is completely normal, and every parent knows that they need to talk to their kids about sex at some point. They can't push that under the rug. But with drugs, I think it is an equally important conversation. But the morality of the subject and the fear and the lack of education amongst adults, amongst an older adult population, means that those conversations are lacking, and that kind of openness is lacking. There's still this fear around it. It's like, well, if you talk to kids about drugs, then kids might use drugs, and there's definitely nuance there, isn't there? That again, me and you are all too aware of it in the work that we've done. You don't go into school; you have to be very careful. It's a very trusted relationship. I've always thought it's a privilege. If you're in an education institution and you have eyeballs on you, kids looking at you to talk to you about drugs, what a privileged position to be in.
Yeah.
But with that privilege comes a huge amount of trust, that you've got to get it right. You can't just go in and just think, I'll just kind of ramble or just say whatever about drugs. Because, you don't want to say. There are things that you could say which would have a detrimental effect on that young person's maybe curiosity or use for drugs. So it is a privileged position. But there's great information out there, and there's great evidence around what those kind of discussions should look like. But I think our kind of broader point, and the thing that's really useful for people to know, is that rapid change in the way in which drugs are sold to young people is creating a challenge and a problem for professionals. And I think that the just generally when it comes to education, when you work in treatment such as yourselves, and you're well equipped with all the information, you walking into a situation where you have to talk to young people about drugs is your bread and butter. You do it with your eyes closed, and you're well equipped to do that because it's, you know, you live it. It's your work. But I think outside of those professions in which you're equipped with the information, you risk being out knowledge, that's not a word, but let's pretend it is, by young people, because they do have access to that information and they are occupying spaces in which those conversations are much more normal. So I think it's so important now for professionals who are experts in this field to be plugged into young people such as yourself and be able to talk to young people. Because if you just go in with the just say no message, or if you just go in being like, don't worry about it, I've got this, I know a bit about drugs. A bit like old school sex education will have been, you know, teachers, I've got this, don't worry, I'll talk to the kids about sex. And they walk in and they say stuff and the kids are like, that's nonsense. You know what I mean? They kind of put the foot in it. I think the same is true of drugs. You can't lie to kids about drugs. You can't scare them and give them information that's untrue. The drugs education that I had was the Leah Betts on a I remember it so vividly, on a projector of her on a life support machine, and saying, if you take drugs, you could just be the unlucky person that's that, and that was kind of it. The kind of discussion stopped there. And again, you and I know all too well that taking MDMA is dangerous. And yeah, you can take MDMA and you can have an extremely adverse reaction. You can lose your life, and that's not a message that you want to. That is the truth. But the reality is much more nuanced and much more complicated than that. So I think the challenge is, because of this digital world that we now operate and this amount of information that young people can access, if you're going to have that conversation, you have to be equipped with the information, and you have to be skilled enough to be straight with them and have an honest conversation. Because if you don't, they'll just catch you out. And I imagine that's probably one of the hardest parts of your job. I imagine that's always the kind of the crux of what's hard about the role, is making sure that you are up to date, you have all the information, and you can present it in a way that engages a young person, rather than stressing them out.
Yeah, it's an endless job, really. I mean, what really works best is that you know, there are some schools in Kent where I have been that face from when they were in year 8 or 9 and they first encountered me in an assembly introducing a service and what we were, to them, you know, I've been doing harm reduction with them and they've been going to university, you know, and that's what really works, because then you start to have a collective group think that actually there is a safe and trusted person who will tell the truth around drugs. And that's one of the biggest kind of issues with you know, your points that were very well made there, Paul, is that I know a lot of teachers, as I'm sure you do, who would love to have informed conversations around drugs. I know a lot of teachers who know a lot about drugs and who are really worried and have a really good safeguarding instinct for the young people in their school or class or form who might be using drugs. But the stigmatization of drugs is what stops them having those conversations, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Because if you're coming from a place which is informed, which again, I have several friends who are, they know that if they try and have that conversation with them, they could well be stigmatized by the institution for which they work, or by the children, because they don't have enough time and space and confidentiality alongside kind of traditional safeguarding methods to have a balanced conversation without someone going, oh, like, you know, Mr. Bennett is clearly doing drugs, you know, like it's, Mr. Bennett loves the gear and could derail a career, in all honesty.
100%.
But by the same token, they're unwilling to kind of use those war stories, or, you know, when I was a boy, you know, things that don't work, because young people cannot empathize or relate to an older person telling them don't do drugs because they mess me up. Like, that doesn't work either, you know. So I think we're kind of hamstrung by the ability to have confidential spaces in educational settings where we can build trust. Because for me, this unique, privileged career has been about it's been about attachments. It's been about attachment theory, relationships, and trust. And it's been about young people not saying anything to me for 3 weeks, but coming back and me saying, "What happened? You know, did anyone kick your door in for being in here? You know, did you get in any trouble?" It's not about putting bad kids into drug education. It's about making young people, taking high status students, the young people who are going out, the young people who are into music, the young people who are doing this stuff, and giving them the ability to pass on peer-to-peer drug education by having relationships with professionals who can give them the tools to do that. And that's what moves the needle. But creating these safe spaces within education is extremely difficult indeed, because it's at a juxtaposition with normalized safeguarding practice, which is we tell everyone and we involve authorities, and we might tell early help, we might tell the police, we'll definitely tell the parents, we'll probably suspend the child, and at the end of all that, go and see Nick from We Are With You. Like, we need to come in earlier. This is what early intervention is about. Early intervention comes before harm reduction, but early intervention introduces stigma, why it's okay to talk about drugs. There's not a kid alive, Paul, who when I walk into a classroom or a youth club or anywhere like that doesn't go like, this guy must have done all the drugs. Like, that's the initial thought, right? If he's here to talk about drugs, he must have done all the drugs. I've got news for you, Paul. I haven't done all the drugs. It's an evidence base. But you need to spend some time talking about why we think this, where it's come from, what stigma is, because once you strip away that and you go, it is the same as sexual health. Mental health, men's mental health 10 years ago was in a terrible place. We know this. It still needs loads of work. But men now feel equipped, and so do females and others, you know, to talk about their mental health. So we know we can do it with mental health. We know we can do it with sexual health. We've done it with race-related issues. You know, now's the time, because drugs are more prevalent than ever. They have a higher purity than ever, and they're cheaper than ever. So we need to act.
Yeah, it's a sketchy time to take drugs. You know, there are many of our colleagues and professionals that we've worked with over the years that know all too well through their harm reduction work what current festival drug use can look like. And every year there are a number of deaths, not just at festivals, but in other places. I think IB for Rocks recently, they've had to shut. Seen this about IB for Rocks? Have kind of closed for a bit while they review the safety policies, because there have been like 3 deaths in 2 weeks or something. Anyway, so you know, there is absolutely a need for this to be a conversation that's at the forefront of education. But I think you kind of touched on 2 things that are really interesting there. One is this: I agree that there is a risk in any old professional talking about drugs to any old kid. You've got to be really careful. You don't want to, 1, give information that's inaccurate and doesn't help the young person, and 2, you don't want to put yourself in a compromised position by which that young person leaves with a false impression. And I've always felt that the professionalisation of drugs education is pivotal to protecting young people. It should definitely be something that takes place in school, without a shadow of a doubt, and across all education institutions, but it should be a professionalised engagement. It shouldn't just be, oh, I'll just do the chat or whatever, or we'll just send them this. It's so important for that interaction to be based on the evidence, not only to protect the staff, but just to make sure that the young person gets the best information they have. So I think, yeah, that's absolutely key. And I think the other kind of, a little bit of an elephant in the room always when you talk about drugs education is the reality that drugs are illegal. Well, the language that we're using, some people might call lazy, but we're talking about illicit drugs. We know that alcohol's a drug, et cetera, but we're talking about drugs that are illegal, although alcohol is illegal for an under 18, so still relevant terminology there. There's this kind of like, there's this tension point, I think, for a lot of young people where they think, but it's illegal, so like, how are you okay to talk to me about it? And if I go around asking to speak to someone about it, surely that's not okay and that's not allowed. Like, why would I tell a professional? Why would I go ask a teacher if I could speak to someone? Why would I tell my parents? Because all I'm going to do is I'm just going to get myself in trouble. So there's this, I think there's this other kind of elephant in the room, even when you go in and you go with like a harm reduction hat on and you're like, right, look, this is evidence-based discussion. I'm here because your school's got me, you know, like, this is completely fine, completely normal. I'm not broken into the classroom or popped up from behind a desk. There's still this elephant in the room where I think the young person is kind of going, yeah, but it's illegal.
There's a risk. There's a risk to me speaking about it. And I definitely saw the same with self-harming behaviours, you know, like 5 or 10 years ago. And a lot of that policy has changed, where young people have bolt holes and, you know, ways that they can kind of get this across. But again, it has to be part of introducing services to young people, because a lot of young people don't know that a drug service exists, and if they do, they have a narrative that comes from modern film, which drugs are about failure, they're about moral or physical failings, or you hit rock bottom. This kind of narrative is very, very strong. Even in like the TikTok space, there's a lot of recovery, there's a lot of don't be like me kind of narrative, which is useful for some people and not for others. But part of it has to be introduced in the service and winning hearts and minds. A little bit what we're trying to do in the Drug Education Forum, really, Paul, is like say that we need to have this conversation. We need you to go back into your schools and advocate for this, to work in partnership like you would with sexual health services, like you would with the NHS, to work in partnership with drug services in order to say, if you need support, then you can come to me and you can say, can I chat with that guy who came and did that assembly? And we'll ask no more questions. And I've definitely developed that relationship with schools across Kent over the last kind of 15 years where that's the case, and other pupils within the school will vouch for you as well and be able to kind of reinforce that. Because without that, of course, you have these, you're just putting a target on your back, right? So it's about, like Bristol kind of becoming a harm reduction city. I would have thought that a very high percentage of the general population in Bristol would understand what that meant, which is that actually we are looking to do anything that would minimise the harms of drugs, and that often starts with education and safe spaces to talk about it, because what we don't want is this knee-jerk reaction. And we've got to be able to get in front of young people to be able to say that to them, to say, actually, if you'd like to speak to us, we've got a online web chat that you can just jump on and you can say, a bald guy with a beard and glasses come and did an assembly at my school today. How do I get hold of him? Yeah, right.
Does he take drugs?
Yeah. You could drop an email, you could fill in an online referral form. So we're getting there as drug services. Dame Carol Black, the Black report that came out several years ago said we need more money, we need more resources, we need more way of reaching people. But one of the most important things is that those people don't feel feel like they've been judged or feel like they've been stigmatized by coming forward. And we think that's lost on 14-year-olds, but it's absolutely not. They need to be protected. They need a safe space to speak about this, because school safeguarding policy does not fit alongside it. And school is such a huge protective factor. We know from like the exclusion to prison pipeline research, which has been well evidenced over the years, that when we've got a young person who might be experimenting with drugs in school, if they're coming to school, what are they saying in that behaviour? They're saying that school is a safe place for them, and they're also making noises or making it somewhat obvious that they're using drugs, intentionally or not. For goodness sake, we need to keep them in school. They're not Pablo Escobar. They're not going to poison everyone. We need to keep them in and work with them within the school as a protective factor, because that structure, for some young people, that's the only structure they might have in their lives. We live in difficult times for many of our young people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we can sort of move this conversation into thinking about what does a drug dealer look like, again, and reflecting on social perceptions of the past to now. But one final point before we kind of jump off this subject around how the digitalisation of drugs being sold impacts on the market, just as a kind of final point. The other thing that I think is really relevant, you mentioned increasing strength. Drugs are much stronger now than they were in the past. I think because the drug market has moved into an online space, it has drastically increased competition. There are more people selling drugs than ever before. There are more people from different backgrounds and experiences selling drugs. It's no longer just something that exists. You don't have to start a gang. It's not just gangs that are selling drugs. It's people that are selling drugs. But that creates a great deal of competition, and in unregulated, high competition markets, becomes very competitive. It doesn't. The price doesn't crank. It's not like things are getting more and more expensive. No, there's so much of it. It's so available, and because everyone's competing for the same market, purity stays up and prices stay low. And we're certainly seeing that, aren't we, amongst drugs? You don't look at drugs and go, this is cocaine purity is not dropping year on year on year. It's same with MDMA. So I think that's another factor that professionals need to be aware of, that the way in which drugs are sold has changed dramatically. And you need to be aware of the consequences and the impact of that. But ultimately, the overall impact is that we really need to speak to young people in an evidence-based way around drugs. There's no more important time than now to talk to young people about the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just purity in that competition, it's diversification of substance as well, you know. And that is a absolute issue, is that unfortunately, if we miss out early intervention, if we miss out talking to groups of young people who we know have autonomy in the community, are being caught vaping, are smoking, or are high status students, you know, then if we miss out speaking to them before something has happened, then we really are in trouble. And, you know, I meet too many young people who have bad experience taking opioids in year 9, year 10, you know, 15, 16, because they're on a Telegram menu. You know, I've met too many young people in secure mental health settings who I'm calling in who have HPPD, you know, hallucinogenic persistent perception disorder, you know, seeing things constantly, you know. Why does this happen? It happens because no one's picking up on the signs before. You know, it happens not just because of autonomy in the community, but autonomy online. And we know about good enough parenting. You know, we know that young people, we want young people to stay at home, but we need to provide something extra. We need young people to have this education around this, because the choice is there. And Telegram menus have, you've seen them, Paul, they have every drug pretty much that we know of that is in any way considered mainstream at all, available at a very affordable price. Yeah. And
that's a great point. I think that's I'm glad you've mentioned that, because that broadening of accessibility is absolutely huge, and a massive change to historically what drug dealing and look like. There would be the person that sells this, the person that sells that, the person that sells the other. But yeah, now that online drug marketplace, it is a menu, and it's
you just work your way through, mate. You know, like that's what young people say. You know, that they started off buying really, really good weed because all they could get was like standard weed. You know, and then you know, we're in the middle of a psychedelic renaissance. If we think this isn't lost on our 16 and 17-year-olds, we're mad. You know, like Michael Pollan's book, you know, How to Change Your Mind, turned into a Netflix series. Type drugs into Netflix. You know, like it is, you could spend a lifetime watching drug sitcoms, documentaries, cartoons, everything. You know, Rick and Morty is potentially like the biggest kind of blend of psychedelic kind of culture and children that, you know, would we have a problem with a 13-year-old watching that? On one hand, yes. On another hand, no. You know, it's very, very tricky to navigate. And then you've got a menu saying like, yeah, we can get you, you know, 8, 10 different kinds of psilocybin mushrooms. You know, you can pick up DMT vapes here, THC vapes here. You know, here's a picture. You've got 500 5-star reviews for this on Telegram that can't be faked. There's an element of harm reduction in the platform. You know, the same reason that the dark web and the Silk Road were invented was this libertarian standpoint, wasn't it? Of if you want to eat plants or do drugs or change consciousness, you can, and this is how we can do it. This is how we can regulate it ourselves. There's an element of that within Telegram, which is a safety net for some, but the policies around it do not protect our young people. And if you're an adult, my view is you can put whatever you want in your body, you know, and if you need support around that, we're here for you. But for young people, we need to protect them against this.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, mate. Yeah, spot on, 100%. Let's think a little bit about some of the groups that we've been talking about here. So we've been talking about young people who procure and use drugs, but we've also been talking about people, both young and adults, who sell drugs. And I feel like that's a conversation that's really lacking. There's not enough nuance in a discussion around what a drug dealer looks like, what the society's perception of a drug dealer. It's the drug dealer of old. It's the wire. It's the gang. And those people, we'd be really foolish and naive to say that those people don't exist. They do, and they're very dangerous gangs, and they commit a lot of harm. You know, there are numerous, more than numerous. There are tons of dangerous gangs that do awful things and also sell drugs. So that's not like we're going, oh, they don't exist. It's actually this. They absolutely exist. No one's saying that isn't a problem. But because of the digitalization of the way in which drugs are sold, we've seen a diversification of drug dealers, right? So how would you describe some of those different kind of demographics, groups, and a lazy term to use, but kind of stereotypes of people that sell drugs?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think it is often lost on certainly professionals. You know, not in our industry necessarily, but what we've seen is a big spotlight shone on county lines, right? And I often get asked if I'm doing training from, my background's treatment, but I'm a harm reduction, early intervention worker, so I do training for staff. For anyone who wants it, I'll go and talk about drugs. But they'll often say, well, what about county lines? Like how many young people are coming into treatment from county lines? And the answer is that number is almost zero. Because those young people, to your point, have been inducted into child slavery. It's a completely different thing, and that those county lines are generally 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100 running heroin and crack to disenfranchised communities, to people who are homeless, who don't have access to the internet, who are living hand to mouth day to day to get medicine. There's this idea that people doing heroin and crack are like, they're the druggies, well, they're not having a great time. They're self-medicating, which is, if we look at why people use drugs, we've got fun and pleasure, and then we've got, as a tool, self-medication. So they're a completely separate entity, because these young people, they are child slaves. So they might be using drugs, but the idea that they'd be stable enough to access any kind of treatment, that they'd be in education to have a conversation with someone like me, that they'd have someone who could just sit them down and go, what would be really useful is if you weren't smoking as much weed. They're off radar, their parents aren't even in touch with them. So we have this kind of real distinction there, which I think is worth kind of highlighting from the start. But then we have this idea that, like you were saying about, if we've got Kev down the road who's the drug dealer, that he's 6'5", he's absolutely hench. He's got 7 staffs.
Yeah, I was going to say.
There's no door on the property.
Yeah. He's got a baseball bat, but never played baseball, that sort of thing.
That's it. There's a gun and a knife on the table, a mountain of powder, and our children are going to Kev. It's like, this is the kind of general idea of it. And I think, we're not here to say that drug dealers are nice people, but if you need something locally, there'll be certain places you'll go and there'll be certain places that you won't. And if you want a drink right now, you're not going to pop outside your studio and buy a glass of homemade lemonade from a man who has got no clothes on by the side of the road, who's smeared in mud. You go to Tesco where it's regulated, or you might go to a farm shop where it's locally pressed. I don't know what kind of guy you are, Paul.
Morrison's.
Right, Morrison's.
Northerners. It was a working man.
Okay. So you're either going for regulation, or you're going somewhere where you go, oh, do you know what? This, like this guy, he makes his own stuff, but it's really, really nice stuff. He presses his own side or whatever it might be. And it's exactly the same for young people and drugs, right? That actually what they will say is that drug dealers are, for one, continually adapting and catering for new user groups. So they're getting different drugs in. They're bringing in things like pre-rolled joints. They're bringing in edibles, so that young people can access that. But also what they don't want is for young people to be too scared to go back, right? So often dealers are, they've got a 2.4 family. They've got a nice dog, they might be making a cup of tea. And what they want to create is an environment where young people come back to them and adults come back to them, because that's what puts food on the table. So we have this media generated idea that they're horrible people who will, rob us and stab us and do the rest of it. And that, of course, these people are there, particularly in the cocaine, crack and heroin markets, particularly in a city where there's less relationships and less kind of trust in the community. But for the majority of our young people, they'll be going somewhere where they think actually they're quite funny, or they're quite nice, or there's never been any bother, they're fair, maybe they've sorted them out on a deal like any business would do, like we've got a new product line, you get buy one, get one free, you get 10% off, buy 5 of these copies, you get your 6th free. It's like any other drug. It doesn't matter if it's regulated or not. We want to create relationships, the royal we want to create relationships with young people so that they might come back for life, because we're not going anywhere and we're definitely not intending on going to prison or anything like that. So let's keep them coming back.
I think that's a really important conversation. That idea that, the drug deal is done with no regard for the drug procurer, and it is a business. People are there are people that are very bad at selling drugs, and there are people that do so with they don't really. But those people, whatever goes wrong for them, they end up in prison. Bad drug dealers don't last very long because they get caught, or they just don't have a market because their product and their way of selling the drugs is no good. So I think there is there are people that maybe do tick some of those boxes, but they're a minority and they quickly dissipate from the market, and it's a very small kind of revolving door. But I think, yeah, the overwhelming majority of people that sell drugs to young people do so in a way by which, yeah, they want them to come back. And I think there's another thing where there's this kind of the perception among society is, well, yeah, they want to get them hooked, like they must give them the strong stuff to get them hooked, so the door, they're kind of knocking on the door. And you know, there is a bit of truth in that the dealer wants the person to have a positive experience so that they do come back and want more drugs. But in my experience of working with people in treatment who are dealing drugs and selling drugs, they're not doing so to young people with complete reckless abandon. It's not kind of like, oh yeah, I'm just doing whatever. I'm at the school gates, I don't really care, I'm trying to make as much money as possible. It's a much more calculated relationship. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is there are adults who don't want to sell drugs to young people, and they don't want to take that risk, whether that's a moral thing or a risk-based thing. Drug dealers are trying to make money, and their whole business survives on going under the radar of the law. It's the one thing that can destroy their business in a second and destroy their life and change everything. It's the ultimate risk that they're taking. And I think for a lot of dealers, actively selling to young people is a huge risk, and it's one that they don't want to take, and it's one that they're not interested in. And I think a byproduct of that that's worth talking about is the way in which young people will then sell to each other. And you will have this, the drug dealing profile is so complicated, it is so broad that it's difficult. It's a very difficult question that I've posed to you, because you can't just go, oh yeah, there's this and this. There's like an infinite, you know,
there really is.
There's an infinite sort of level of number of categories of people that sell drugs. But what I think is very, very common, particularly amongst older young people, the sort of 18-24 category, the university cohort, is young people selling drugs to each other out of convenience, out of the fact, you know, that one person is on the dark web. So look, I'm going on the dark web, I'm getting X drug. I may as well order a load. Who else wants some? You know, we're all going to a rave or we're going to a festival. What's the point in us all going? You know, it's just kind of a matter of convenience. You know, if a bunch of young people are ordering a takeaway, one person will order the pizzas and everyone will give them the money. It's not a weird thing to be like, I'll get the pizzas, can everyone give me the money? And the way in which young people buy drugs is very similar. So I've had a lot of conversation with young people around, I completely understand that. It makes absolute sense. However, in the eyes of the law, you are a drug dealer, and the risk that you are taking in procuring drugs for people, you might just think you're doing your mates a favour, but you are putting yourself in a huge position of risk. And I think there's this kind of like ignorance and ambivalence to it. Yeah, it's just kind of something you do, but that carries an unbelievable risk. If anything goes wrong, you know, if a young person has procured drugs for 6 people, and you're going to a festival, and you know, this MDMA pills are unbelievably strong at the moment. It's very easy to have an adverse, dangerous reaction to MDMA, and if someone does so, and you know, God forbid, we're looking at sort of worst case scenarios, and the police start getting involved to find out how, you know, something's gone terribly wrong. How did this person get drugs? They're going to take their phone and they're going to ask all their mates, who did they buy this from? And it's very likely that they'll work out that you get from the drugs. And there are people in prison for that, aren't there, Nick? There are people in prison for giving friends, partners, drugs and something going wrong. So I think the way in which we talk about drug dealing, it also needs to be a message that we give to young people of like, in the eyes of the law, if you give drugs to another person, you're a drug dealer, and the consequences are incredibly steep, incredibly severe. Do you kind of see that amongst young people that you work, that kind of ambivalence, ignorance around that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it runs a little bit deeper in that I think it's an ambivalence around the law. I think it's an ambivalence around seeing firsthand. You know, we spoke earlier about if we tell kids that any pill can kill, the Leah Betts kind of narrative, and they go out and they see 50,000 people in front of the main stage at Boomtown, and they know through intuition or education that the majority of them are on MDMA, and then you go to welfare tent, and in MDMA you might have 2 people who are overheating a little bit, or you might even have a tragedy, but you know, actually you can look at the risk, right? Like the same as you can if you're playing football and you're going for a 50-50 tackle. There's a small risk that you could come off injured, but you're probably going to be all right. So you know, there's one side of it kind of using scaremongering, if we were scaremongering young people and then they're coming out the other side going, you're talking nonsense, I'm not going to listen to you. I kind of, the young people have the same narrative around the law that you can, and I say this to young people, I say the reason I'm here talking to you about drugs is because drugs are everywhere. If you walk through the town centre here, you'll smell weed. And often that weed will be coming off someone's zoo who's walking down the middle of the road in the town centre. So where are the police? And I'm not saying that in any derogatory sense. I know the pressures that statutory services are under across the board. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying for if you're a young person and you're smoking weed every day this summer and you've been displaced from your home because of that, so you're out and about essentially in the community, and you've never once been told to put it out by a copper, let alone be threatened with kind of any engagement or any kind of arrest or diversion or anything like that, then how do we kind of say like drugs being illegal, it's almost not worth us talking about. Like obviously we do, we cover the law, but there's lots of issues with the law in our classes as well. But that's a difficult conversation. So if you bring that back to social dealing of like, if you buy 5 grams of ketamine, it's going to be 15 quid a gram. But if you can buy an ounce, like at the moment on Telegram, that'll get it down to 6 quid a gram. It's not just a no-brainer in terms of you buying the pizza and the convenience. It's a no-brainer in that you're getting free drugs and you're not seeing that as being a nefarious individual, which goes back to our point. You're providing a service, and that service has limited risks because of the encryption, because you've got an address where no one's going to check that. And I never hear of things being intercepted in the post and that kind of thing. It's then the fact that you've got to get that into a festival, and these kind of steps that, it's a different conversation for a different day, but, the difference between taking your own drugs to a festival that have been tested or come from Kevin, that, pretty much they're going to be okay versus sniffer dogs and biting inside of it.
Yeah.
Different, exponentially more dangerous.
Yeah, agree. And I think that I agree 100%. And I appreciate that, like, that message to young people of being like, hey, if you give drugs to someone else, you get in trouble, does come with a kind of young people looking at going, yeah, but that's kind of what everybody does. But I think this is why the conversation's so important. It's because when it does go wrong, it goes really, really, really wrong. When drugs go wrong for a young person, people lose their life. And when they go wrong for groups of people, people's lives are like, it's so unbelievably devastating. I think for me, that always underlines why it's such an important conversation and why we have to drop all that baggage that we bring with us and just have an honest chat. And I've always loved the honesty and openness around drugs education it does tick boxes for me, like ideologically, just as a little bit of a sort of libertarian-esque position of like, if you choose to do this, at least do it with all the information available so you can make the best decision. And you do you, but I respect and care about you enough to give you all the information. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to scare you. You go make that decision. And I appreciate that with young people, their brains are developing. They're taking much more risks. We're dealing with cohorts that you've mentioned who have strong vulnerabilities that make them more susceptible. But to me, that's why drugs education is one of the most important conversations we can have for young people, because if we don't have it with those groups, then they later life find themselves in awful situations. So yeah, I think I agree 100% with that. And that, maybe that's a future conversation. And we've got Fiona Measham on. In fact, I'm speaking to Fiona Measham tomorrow. Fiona's coming on very, very, very soon, and we're going to be having that discussion around festivals, some of the nuances and challenges there. Because it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that you go to Boomtown and there's sniffer dogs and all this stuff, and then you go in Boomtown and everybody's on drugs. So there's this kind of like, it's kind of like this like, what is all that for? Like, what is going on here? Like,
there's definitely some pretense, because we knowingly decriminalise drugs on that patch of land and on the other patch of land that festivals operate within. Within that fence, we actively decriminalise drugs for that weekend, pretty much. That police volunteer to work in that. They have a different remit potentially to what they do on the street. There's adequate resources to work with people who have adverse reactions. There's mental health, there's sexual assault, there's everything there that you could ever want. And, perhaps if we could replicate that kind of setup in society, maybe we might see a few less tragedies. But you're right. The education must come first, and the education must be as diverse and as bespoke and as pure as the drugs themselves. That it has to be age appropriate. It has to take into account different genders, different ideologies, different kind of education settings, families. That we can't just throw a blanket under this. There's never been a more important time to have specialist drug workers talking to young people in safe spaces.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's a good summary to end the conversation. And I think you also allude to, a very, very complicated, deep conversation around what should we do about drugs in society. But I honestly feel like we are so far from that conversation. I feel like we are going further and further away from that conversation. And to me, that makes it all the more important just to get in and do some of the work that you're doing and do the work that the DF's doing, and just get in front of people and have honest, open conversations around drugs, particularly young people. And I guess as a final point for anyone that's watched the show or listened in is there are groups and organisations around that will bend over backwards to help you educate young people on drugs and educate yourself on drugs. So get in touch with us at the forum. We have an amazing network. We do lots of events by which we have really interesting speakers come and talk about their research and their work that they're doing on drugs. So do use the forum as a way of networking and finding people that can help reduce drug-related harm, because that's what we care about, isn't it, Nick?
100%, sir.
Thanks so much for the chat, mate. I've enjoyed that as much as I knew I would. Although you do maybe feel a little bit old, but that's okay.
Absolute pleasure both ways.
I think we are old, mate. That's the problem. All right. Cheers, mate. See you next time.
Thanks, mate.
So thanks so much for watching today's video. Next time we've got Fiona Measham. It's a really, really, really good chat. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. Check out the Drug Education Forum. Link is in the description below. Let us know what you think in the comments. And please share this video or this podcast, whoever you are listening to it or watching it, amongst your colleagues, as we think this information is really important and must be shared. Thanks for watching. See you next time.